Welcome back to Sleepy Town Radio, where the past is soft, the nights are slow, and the stories take their time. Maybe you're lying in bed right now, eyes still open, hoping the world outside might quiet down just enough to let you drift. Or maybe you're just looking for something gentler, something a little slower than the pace we're all stuck in these days. Well, tonight I'll take you somewhere quieter, somewhere older, somewhere that still echoes if you know how to listen. My name's Walter Thomas. I was born in 1944 in a little timber town tucked among the evergreens and misty roads of western Oregon, Cottage Grove. Back then, it wasn't much more than a few gravel streets, a wooden bridge or two, and a drugstore with a soda fountain that made the best cherry cokes this side of the Cascades. It was the kind of place where screen doors were never locked, where every kid knew the smell of split pine and diesel, and where the world felt big, but safe. No one called it simpler times back then. It was just life. But looking back, through the cracks of memory, it does feel quieter, and maybe a little kinder. Tonight, I want to tell you what it was really like to grow up in a place like that, in the 1950s in small-town Oregon. Not the TV version, not the postcard, just a real boy, in a real town, living through a moment that nobody thought would ever feel far away. So if you're ready, close your eyes, breathe slow, and let's go back there together. Back to when front doors stayed open, radios hummed from kitchen counters, and kids like me had no idea we were growing up in what would one day feel like another world. Let's begin. I suppose it's hard to explain just how much trust there was back then. It wasn't something anyone really talked about. We didn't have to. It was just part of the air we breathed. In our town, people didn't lock their doors. Not at night, not when they went to work, not even when they were out of town most of the time. There was a kind of quiet agreement, an unspoken understanding that no one would take what wasn't theirs, and that if something did happen, well, the neighbors would notice before you even did. At our house on 4th Street, the front door had a skeleton key lock, the old-fashioned kind you'd see in antique shops now, but we almost never used it. If we went away for a weekend, maybe to visit my cousins down near Grants Pass, my parents would lock the door out of habit, and then they'd leave the key right up on top of the door frame. That's where everyone kept it. It was like saying, "This is yours if you need it. Just put it back when you're done." We weren't naive. There were rules, sure. If someone came by and nobody was home, they didn't just waltz in. But if they really needed something, some sugar for a pie or a wrench from the garage, they'd leave a note. Take what they needed, and you'd find a pie on your doorstep the next morning in return. That was the kind of economy we had. The currency was trust. I remember once, around the summer of '52, my dad forgot his wallet on the dashboard of the pickup truck. It sat there in plain sight for 2 whole days. Nobody touched it. Not even the neighborhood boys who liked to snoop. And when he finally picked it up again, he just laughed. "Still there," he said, "just like I left it." That's what made Cottage Grove feel like its own little world. Like the rules outside didn't always apply here. Most folks in town left their cars unlocked too, keys tucked into the visor or just sitting in the ignition. The idea of someone stealing a car was almost absurd. Who would you even sell it to? Everyone knew everyone else's license plate, and half the time their cousins too. But it went deeper than just doors and keys. Kids walked home from school alone. Some of us, like me, even biked clear across town to the mill road just to fish in the creek. My mother never worried. Well, she worried, but not about strangers. Her biggest concern was whether I'd scuff my shoes or fall in the water again. Even when the sun dipped below the trees and the shadows got long, there was no fear. Porch lights came on automatically, not because we were afraid of the dark, but because we were waiting for someone to come home. There was comfort in the glow. You could ride your bike past 5 houses in a row and see 5 porch lights on, radios humming through screen doors, and someone always out there watering their garden or calling their dog back in. Sometimes I'd walk past old Mrs. Kershaw's house at night, and her front window would be wide open, curtains billowing in the breeze, soft light flickering from a little TV set in the corner. She'd wave at me from her chair, a cup of tea in her hand, and I'd wave back. Nothing ever felt hidden. No one ever seemed afraid. It wasn't that crime didn't exist. Now and then someone would talk about some teenager getting caught breaking into the school supply shed, or someone borrowing a bottle from behind the diner. But it was rare and it was small. Just little cracks in an otherwise solid wall of trust. And when they happened, the whole town seemed to flinch at once, like something sacred had been disturbed. One year, I think it was 56, someone actually broke into the general store one night. Didn't steal much, just a few cartons of cigarettes and a couple dollars from the register. The next morning, it was all anyone could talk about. It was front-page news in the Cottage Grove Sentinel. I remember my dad shaking his head at the breakfast table. "You know," he said, "when folks start locking their doors, it's not because they're scared. It's because something precious went missing, and they're not sure if it'll come back." But for most of my childhood, that never happened. For most of those golden years, the doors stayed open. Not just our houses, but our lives. And I think that's what I miss most. Not the buildings. Not even the people, though I miss them too. But the feeling that you were safe. That you were held in some quiet, invisible way. That the world was watching over you, gently, like a mother's hand resting on your back as you slept. I've heard people say that locking your door is just being smart these days. Maybe they're right. Maybe trust has become a luxury we can't afford. But still, when I close my eyes, I can hear the creak of that screen door on a summer night. I can feel the breeze through the house, the stillness of the front yard, the hum of crickets. And I remember what it was like to fall asleep, knowing that every door on the street was wide open. No locks, no fear. They say childhood is freedom, but I don't think most folks today really know what that used to mean. In Cottage Grove, when I was a boy, freedom didn't come with helmets, schedules, or check-ins. It came with a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a mother calling after you, "Be home by dark." That was it. That was the rule. No GPS, no cell phone, no bike helmet, no grown-up shadowing you from 20 feet behind. Just you, your imagination, and the open world. I was 6 the first time my mum let me walk all the way down to the river by myself. The Coast Fork Willamette, It curved like a silver ribbon past town, past the sawmill, and into the woods. I'd pack a peanut butter sandwich and an old metal thermos of warm milk, and I'd disappear for hours. Not lost, just gone. There were blackberry thickets taller than I was. If you knew the good spots, you could fill a whole tin pail before the noon sun hit your back. My hands would be stained purple and scratched to ribbons, and I'd ride home with a smile so wide you'd think I'd found gold. Sometimes I'd go with my best friend Curtis. He lived 3 blocks down across from the feed store. He had a Schwinn bike with red handlebars and a front basket we filled with frogs, rocks, and once a snapping turtle that nearly took off his finger. Our world wasn't mapped. It was discovered. We built forts in drainage ditches. We played marbles in the dust behind the school. We dared each other to cross the train trestle without stopping, and once we both had to jump down the embankment when a train came through early. We didn't tell our parents about that one, but that was the beauty of it. You had space to learn the world, not from a book, not from a screen, from the sting of nettles, the hiss of a garter snake, the thrill of climbing too high and getting stuck in a tree with no way down but gravity. We had our boundaries, of course. Don't talk to strangers. Don't go in anyone's house without asking. Don't go past the old mill road. But within those borders, we were kings. And when the day began to fade, the light getting syrupy and low, you knew it was time to head home. There were no watches on our wrists. We didn't need them. You could feel the sun slip behind the trees like a curtain pulling shut. You could hear the world changing, the birds going quiet, the crickets tuning up, the last train rumbling distant and slow. That was our clock. That was our curfew. And if you lingered too long, well, your mama might come out onto the porch and call your full name into the wind. And in a town like Cottage Grove, you can bet half the neighborhood would hear it. Sometimes I missed the sound of kids shouting in the distance, their voices echoing off trees, their laughter bouncing down alleyways. Now you hardly hear that. Kids don't roam anymore. They're scheduled, monitored, managed. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I know the world's changed. But there was something sacred in being trusted like that. When a child is trusted, they grow a little taller inside. They start to believe that they're capable, that they can figure things out, climb that tree, catch that fish, fix that flat tire with nothing but a pocket knife and a rock. Made us resourceful. And that resourcefulness turned into quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't shout but stays with you for life. I remember once my bike chain slipped on the far side of town, near where the road turned to gravel. It was hot and I was tired, and I didn't have any tools. But I sat in the shade of a fence post and used a stick to realign the sprocket teeth. Took me 20 minutes. When I finally got home, my mum didn't ask why I was late. She just looked at my greasy hands, handed me a rag, and smiled. There was pride in moments like that, pride that didn't need to be spoken. We learned responsibility the same way we learned everything else, through doing. If you got a scrape, you cleaned it. If your tire went flat, you pushed your bike until you figured it out. And if you broke someone's window with a baseball, you knocked on their door, apologized, and offered to mow their lawn for 2 weeks. No lectures, no drama, just ownership. And we were present. That's another thing I miss. When you were out in the world, you were there. Not half glancing at a screen, not waiting for a text, not posting a photo for likes. You were fully immersed in the pine needles under your shoes, the sweat on your brow, the shimmer of dust in the late afternoon sun. Curtis and I once spent an entire day trying to dam up a little stream behind the school. We piled rocks, branches, even an old tire someone left out. Of course, it collapsed an hour later. But I remember every detail, the cold of the water, the smell of wet grass, the way we couldn't stop laughing when it all gave way and soaked our shoes. That kind of joy doesn't come with achievement. It comes with presence. With being in a moment so fully that it becomes part of who you are. And that, to me, was childhood freedom. Not just the ability to go anywhere, but the permission to be there, wholly and freely. People sometimes ask if we were ever afraid. The answer is yes, but not in the way folks mean. We were afraid of getting caught sneaking a second piece of pie, afraid of getting our Sunday clothes dirty before church, afraid of disappointing our parents, not because of punishment, but because their pride mattered to us. Real fear? No. The world felt big, yes, but never threatening. It was a world you could walk through barefoot with pockets full of rocks and come home with stories to tell. And every night, after the dirt had been scrubbed from our knees and the frogs were let back into the ditch, we'd lay in bed and stare at the ceiling fans spinning slow overhead. And we'd dream of tree houses and new trails, of summer days that never ended, of freedom, the kind you don't even know is rare until it's gone. Holidays meant something different back then. They weren't about how much you spent, or how early the sales started, or what went viral on TV. They were slower, softer. They crept up on you like the smell of cinnamon from a neighbor's kitchen, or the first morning you saw your breath outside. And of all the holidays, Halloween was my favorite. There was something magical about it, not just spooky or silly, but magical, because it was one of the few nights a year when kids ruled the streets. We didn't have the fancy costumes you see today, no plastic masks from the store or battery-powered blinking things. We made our own. Curtis and I would dig through old trunks in our attics, find worn-out hats, flannel shirts, pillowcases. Sometimes I'd go as a hobo with burnt cork rubbed on my cheeks and suspenders that didn't fit. Other years I was a cowboy or a ghost made from a torn sheet. The older kids, usually 10 or 11, might get a little more creative. Scarecrows, Frankenstein, even a skeleton if their mum had the time and thread. But none of us cared what the others wore. We weren't dressing to impress. We were dressing to belong. There were no adults walking beside us, just a group of kids, flashlights swinging, pillowcases for candy, and the sound of leaves crunching under our feet. We stuck to the houses we knew, Mrs. Abernathy, the Johnsons, the old couple who owned the hardware store. Everyone left their porch lights on. Some gave out popcorn balls, some gave caramel apples, and a few, bless their hearts, handed out full-size candy bars, the kind that felt heavy in your bag and made the night feel like a jackpot. Nobody worried back then, nobody checked wrappers or shined flashlights through apples. The stories about razors and poisons, they came later. But in the Cottage Grove, I knew Halloween was safe. It was community, and there was something beautiful about that sense of trust, even on a night when everyone pretended to be someone else. I still remember the way the cold air bit at your cheeks, how your hands got sticky from melted candy, and how your feet hurt just enough to remind you how far you'd walked. When the night was over, you'd dump your bag on the living room rug, sorting candy into little piles, chocolates, suckers, mystery toffees in orange wrappers. My dad would steal a piece or two when he thought I wasn't looking, and my mum would let me have just one more before bed. But Halloween was just the start. The real season, the magic season, was the weeks that followed. Thanksgiving in our house meant long tables with mismatched chairs. We didn't have a dining room big enough, so we'd push everything together. Kitchen table, card table, even the ironing board once, to make it work. My grandmother's stuffing was always too salty. My aunt's rolls always a little burnt. But nobody minded, because it wasn't about perfection. It was about together. We'd go around the table, one by one, saying what we were thankful for. My granddad always said the same thing. I'm thankful the roof held through the last storm. It was a quiet kind of humour, but we all smiled. The smell of roasted turkey, pumpkin pie, coffee on the stove, it filled the whole house for days. Even the wallpaper seemed to hold on to it. But the most magical of all was Christmas. Not because of the gifts, but because of the waiting. Christmas in Cottage Grove was slow and sacred. It built gradually, day by day, as windows frosted over and candles appeared on window sills. We didn't have inflatable Santas or flashing lights. Most houses had a single string of coloured bulbs nailed carefully along the porch. Some blinked, most didn't. Our tree came from the hills. My dad and I would drive out into the cold, hike through damp pine until he found one just the right size, not too tall, not too bare, and we'd cut it down ourselves. The car would smell like sap for weeks. Decorating was a family event. We had boxes of old ornaments, some made from clothespins, others from salt dough. There was a paper angel I made in first grade that always went near the top, no matter how crooked it leaned. We didn't get a lot of presents, usually one thing we needed, boots, a coat, and one thing we wanted. For me, that was a red sled one year, a little train another. I still remember the sound of it circling the tree, clacking over the track, smoke puffing from the tiny chimney. But the best part wasn't the morning, it was the night before. We'd sit by the fire, all the lights turned low except the tree. My mom would read from an old book of poems, and my dad, he'd tell the story of the Christmas when he got an orange, a single orange, and how it was the sweetest thing he ever tasted. It wasn't just a holiday, it was a feeling, a slowing down, a remembering. It was the hush that fell over town after a snowfall. The way the world seemed to pause for just a little while and let you feel small and safe and loved. And maybe that's what holidays gave us most. Not the candy or the toys or the pies, but the reminder that we belonged, to each other, to this place, to the quiet rhythm of the seasons. Even now, all these years later, when the nights get long and the air turns crisp, I swear I can still hear it. The rustle of costumes in the dark, the clink of silverware on mismatched plates, the soft hush of snow outside the window. Memory has a way of holding on to the warmth, and when it does, the past doesn't feel quite so far away. If you grew up in a small town in the 1950s, you probably didn't live alone. Not really. Sure, there were just 5 of us in our house, my mum, my dad, my little sister, and me. But on weekends, holidays, or any ordinary Sunday afternoon, it felt like the walls stretched to fit a dozen more. Back then, family didn't mean just the people under your roof. It meant your cousins down the road, your grandparents 2 blocks over, your uncle who lived in a trailer behind the church and fixed lawnmowers for most of the town. Family was everyone who showed up when it mattered, and someone always showed up. I remember Sunday dinners that began sometime around noon and lasted well into the evening. There were mashed potatoes, pot roast, biscuits the size of your hand, and my Aunt Lillian's green Jell-O salad that nobody liked, but everyone took a spoonful of out of respect. We'd eat, laugh, argue, and eat again. Kids sat on the floor or the porch steps. Grown-ups took turns washing dishes and passing around coffee in mismatched mugs. Sometimes the men played horseshoes out back. Sometimes the women sat in lawn chairs fanning themselves and talking about neighbors who weren't there. We didn't have much, but there was always enough. Enough food, enough time, enough room at the table, even if someone had to balance a plate on their lap. And when dinner was done and the light had started to fade, we'd gather on the front porch. There was a rhythm to those porch evenings, like the slow winding down of a lullaby. My grandfather would settle into the old rocking chair that creaked with every movement. Someone would light a bug coil, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals. The kids would sprawl on the floorboards with comic books or mason jars of lightning bugs. And the adults would talk about nothing and everything, politics, weather, the crops that year, whether the cherries would come early. It didn't matter what was said. What mattered was the feeling that you belonged to something steady, something rooted. There was safety in the sameness. You always knew who would be sitting in which chair, what stories would be told, which dog would bark at what passing car. And sometimes, if you were lucky, someone would bring out a guitar. Uncle Frank played old hymns and cowboy ballads. My dad would hum along softly while tapping his foot, and my grandma, usually so quiet, would sing harmony so pure and unexpected it gave me goosebumps. Looking back, those evenings were church in their own way. Speaking of church, religion in our town wasn't something that got shouted from rooftops. It wasn't painted on billboards or preached at you on street corners. It was quiet, woven into everyday life like thread in a quilt. Most folks went to church on Sunday. Some didn't. Nobody made a fuss about it either way. Our family went to the little white clapboard church on Elm Street. It had a single bell in the tower, wooden pews that creaked, and a preacher who told stories more than sermons. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't talk about fire or damnation. He talked about kindness, about doing what was right, even when no one was looking. He told stories about the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, and that one about the mustard seed. How something so small could grow into something so big. As a kid, I didn't understand all of it, but I remember the feeling. The stained glass windows casting rainbow patterns across the floor. The smell of old hymnals and lemon polish. The way my mum would softly squeeze my hand during the final prayer. It was peace. Not the loud kind. The kind that settles into your bones without you realizing. And no one cared if you didn't go every week. No one whispered if you skipped Easter or forgot to dress up. What mattered most was whether you showed up for people when they needed you. Whether you were honest. Whether you were kind. In that way, faith wasn't about saying anything. It was about living something. And it showed up in the smallest things. The neighbor who left eggs on your porch without a note. The man who fixed your fence while you were at work and never asked for payment. The woman who baked 2 pies every time just so she could give one away. That was religion in our town, not a performance, a practice. And for me, it all came together on those front porches, on quiet Sunday nights when the air was soft and the world had slowed to a crawl. You could sit out there for hours and not say a word, just listen. To the frogs down by the creek, to the hum of a far-off radio playing Glenn Miller or Patsy Cline, to the rocking chair creaking in rhythm with the crickets. And if you listened closely enough, you could hear the heartbeat of the town. Not just the noise, but the pulse, the steady rhythm of families sharing meals, kids chasing fireflies, neighbors swapping stories, people living slow and living well. I think that's what I miss most about those days, not the simplicity, or the nostalgia, or even the quiet. I miss the closeness, the knowing, the sense that if something went wrong, someone would knock on your door before you even had to ask for help. And it wasn't perfect. Of course it wasn't. Families argued, people got their feelings hurt. Sometimes things were said that couldn't be taken back. But when it counted, when life got heavy, someone always came. With a casserole, with a hammer, with a prayer. And when the night finally came to an end, and the porch light flickered off, you'd go to bed with the sound of voices still echoing in your ears. Not loud, not urgent, just warm, like a song you forgot you knew the words to. If there's one thing my parents never had to teach me with words, it was the value of hard work. Because in our house, in our town, work wasn't something you talked about. It was just something you did. And you did it because that's what people did. There were no gold stars for effort, no pats on the back for showing up. No one called it a grind or a hustle. Those words would have sounded ridiculous to us. Work was life. It was woven into every morning, every chore, every quiet evening when your hands were sore and your shirt stuck to your back from sweat. My first real job, if you could call it that, was stacking firewood behind the house. I must have been 6 or 7. We had a big iron stove in the kitchen and another in the living room, and both of them needed feeding through the fall and winter. So every few weeks a truck would drop a load of split oak beside the shed, and my job was to stack it neatly, tight rows like puzzle pieces. No one watched me do it. No one gave me a deadline or a prize. It just needed doing, and I was part of the family, so I did it. Later came other jobs, chopping kindling, fetching water, collecting eggs from the chicken coop before the hens got too feisty, helping my dad clean the barn, pitchfork in hand, boots 2 sizes too big. He never yelled. Never made a big show of teaching. He just handed me the tool, showed me once, and walked away. And in that quiet transfer, just a glance, just a nod, I learned everything. By the time I was 10, I could drive our old farm truck across the field. Not on the road, of course, but out behind the barn, where the rows of hay had been mown low and the dirt track was wide and rutted. The truck was a Batu surplus rig with a stiff clutch and no power steering. I had to scoot all the way forward and stretch to reach the pedals, turning the big steel wheel with both hands like I was steering a ship. But I learned. Because I had to. There was hay to haul, feed to deliver, fencing to repair. No one said, "You're too young." They just said, "Be careful." And that was enough. Curtis and I used to joke that we had resumes by age 12. We'd helped roof sheds, dig ditches, plant rows of beans, and set irrigation pipes. Once, I even helped birth a calf, late at night, in the freezing dark, holding a lantern while my uncle worked with thick gloves and calm hands. That night stuck with me. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was just another thing that needed doing. And I got to be there. I got to be part of it. There's a kind of quiet pride that comes from work like that. Not the kind you post about. Not the kind anyone claps for, but the kind that settles into your bones, the kind that tells you, I can handle things, I've done hard things before, I'll do them again. And let me tell you, every kid in Cottage Grove knew how to work. We mowed lawns, we picked berries for the cannery at 5 cents a flat, we raked leaves, washed cars, pulled weeds, painted sheds. Sometimes we got paid, sometimes we didn't. Didn't matter. What mattered was showing up. What mattered was being useful. My mom always said that being useful was the best thing you could be. Not brilliant, not beautiful, useful. So we were. Even the things that weren't really jobs felt like work back then. School wasn't optional, and it wasn't supposed to be fun. You went, you listened, you did your work, and you did it well. And if you got in trouble, well, you dealt with it. Because that was part of the deal too. There was no whining, at least not for long. If you complained about chores, my dad would just hand you a bigger shovel. If you got tired, my grandfather would remind you of the time he picked cotton barefoot in Georgia as a boy, and somehow that made you want to keep going. But here's the thing, even though the work was hard, even though the days were long, I never felt unloved, never felt used, because the work wasn't punishment, it was participation. We were part of the household, part of the land, part of the rhythm. We didn't do chores because our parents wanted a break. We did them because the whole thing worked when we all showed up. And when we did a job right, even something small, we got something better than praise. We got trust. I remember the first time my dad let me sharpen his tools. It was a big deal. He laid out the file, showed me the angle just once, and said, "Go slow, feel it." That was it. No micromanaging, no double-checking. And I sat there on the back step for almost an hour, sliding metal against metal, feeling the edge come back alive. When he used it later and nodded just once, I felt taller than I'd ever felt in my life. That's what work did for us. It shaped us, quietly, patiently. It taught us how to fix things that were broken, how to listen, how to wait, how to be okay with getting dirty and not getting credit. And it kept us grounded in a world that keeps spinning faster, shouting louder. I think about those quiet mornings in the barn, the sound of the chickens rustling, the scrape of a shovel on packed earth, my breath rising in the cold, no music, no chatter, just doing, and the strange, beautiful peace that came with it. Because work, when you're young and trusted, teaches you more than responsibility. It teaches you humility. You learn that you're not above anything, that no task is beneath you, that real strength has nothing to do with ego and everything to do with showing up again and again without fanfare. Work hard, stay humble. That's what we lived by. Not because it was written on the wall, but because we saw it lived out in our father's hands, our mother's patience, our grandparents' quiet pride. And now, all these years later, when the world feels chaotic and uncertain, I still come back to that, to the rhythm of honest work, to the dignity of a job well done, to the sound of a child stacking firewood in the golden afternoon light, and knowing it matters. The school bell in Cottage Grove rang just once every morning at 8 sharp. It wasn't a loud sound, not like the shrill electric tones they use now. Ours was a single, deep clang from a cast-iron bell in the steeple of the old schoolhouse, rung by hand with a rope worn soft from decades of use. You could hear it from just about anywhere in town, and when it rang, kids came running, books under their arms, lunch pails swinging, hair still wet from being combed too fast. My school was a 2-story wooden building painted white, with tall windows that stuck in summer and creaked in winter. The floorboards echoed with every step, and the smell inside was a mix of pencil shavings, chalk dust, and the faint, comforting scent of old books. My first teacher, Miss Garrett, was a stern woman with soft hands. She wore her hair in a bun and always kept a handkerchief tucked in her sleeve. She never raised her voice, but somehow her quiet stare could hush a room faster than any shout. She believed in order, discipline, and doing your best, especially when no one was watching. But she also believed in stories. At the end of every day, she'd read to us books like Charlotte's Web, The Boxcar Children, Where the Red Fern Grows. She'd sit by the window, the sun hitting her glasses just right, and her voice would carry us somewhere else entirely. That's how I first started learning that the world was bigger than our town, that there were places with deserts, oceans, and skyscrapers, things I hadn't yet seen but could imagine just clearly enough to believe they were real. Learning for us wasn't just about facts. It was about formation, about growing into people our families could be proud of. We recited the Pledge of Allegiance every morning, hand over heart. We learned cursive by copying letters over and over until our wrists ached. We memorized multiplication tables and recited poetry aloud, one by one, even if our voices shook. We didn't have computers or calculators or even air conditioning. But we had chalkboards, maps that pulled down from rollers, and globes that spun on squeaky stands. And we had attention, the focused kind, because there weren't 1,000 things vying for it. And if you misbehaved, you stayed after school and clapped chalkboard erasers together behind the building until the dust turned your shirt grey. That was punishment. But really, it was time to think. One time I got caught carving my initials into the underside of a desk. Miss Garrett didn't scold me in front of the class. She just waited until dismissal, walked me back to the desk and handed me a piece of sandpaper. "Undo it," she said softly. It took the better part of an hour, and I never carved anything into anything again. That was the lesson. You didn't just get told what was right. You practiced it. You repaired it. And slowly, almost without realizing it, you learned how to live. There were no gifted programs or advanced placements. You weren't labeled or streamed. If you were behind, you stayed after. If you were ahead, you helped someone else. No one got left behind because no one wasn't worth teaching. We shared rulers and crayons and passed notes when we weren't supposed to. We whispered during spelling tests and sometimes copied each other's answers, though the guilt afterward was often worse than the grade. Our lunchroom wasn't much to look at. Long tables, metal trays, little cartons of milk. But it was where we learned just as much as in class. We learned who to sit with, how to trade a sandwich without shortchanging someone, how to say thank you to the lunch lady even if the peas were mushy. And out on the playground, that's where the world really showed its colors. There were kickball games, jump rope, tag that lasted through recess and into lunch. There were arguments, bruises, scraped knees, and tears. But we learned how to apologize, how to forgive, how to shake hands, and try again the next day. Those were the little things that shaped us. And at the center of it all was respect. We respected our teachers, not out of fear, but out of recognition that they gave us something every day that couldn't be measured. Time, patience, belief. And we respected each other, even if we didn't always like one another. Because we all went to the same school. We all rode the same buses, walked the same sidewalks, sat in the same desks. We were equals, at least that's what we were taught. And that's what most of us believed. Looking back, I realize how much of the world I understand now came from that time, not just arithmetic or geography, but the shape of things. How to pay attention, how to listen longer than you wanted to, how to hold silence when someone else was speaking, how to take turns. I think we forget how valuable that kind of learning is. It's not flashy. It doesn't show up on transcripts or resumes, but it builds the kind of people who last. And when we did get home, homework wasn't a fight, not because we loved it, but because we knew it mattered. It was part of our job, just like milking the cow or washing the dishes. Sometimes I'd do my spelling under the soft glow of the kitchen light while my mum folded laundry beside me. Sometimes on the porch with my feet up on the railing and the sound of crickets rising from the fields. No rush, no pressure. Just the steady rhythm of doing what needed to be done. And every now and then, after all the lessons and the chores, my dad would say, "Come on, let's go outside." We'd walk together in the quiet, just a few blocks. He'd point to the stars, talk about constellations, tell me things I'd never find in a textbook. "That's Orion," he'd say. "And that bright one there, that's Venus, always low in the sky." Those walks taught me something else, that not everything we need to know comes from a book or a teacher's chalkboard. Some things we learn just by looking up, by listening, by walking slowly with someone who cares enough to show you the world. And I suppose that's what real learning is, not cramming facts, but forming awareness, not just of things, but of people, of time, of truth. And maybe that's what I miss most about those old wooden classrooms and those sunlit afternoons with spelling lists and erasers and world maps with frayed corners. It wasn't just about preparing for the world, it was about becoming part of it. One lesson, one moment, one quiet teacher at a time. It might surprise some folks today, but in Cottage Grove, Oregon, back in the 1950s, almost every household had at least one gun. Some had more. A hunting rifle over the fireplace, a shotgun in the back of the closet, a .22 that sat on a rack in the truck, always clean and always ready. But the strange thing was, no one was afraid of them. Guns weren't symbols, they weren't political, they weren't toys either. They were tools, like an axe or a wrench. Something you respected, something you used with purpose and care. I was 5 when I first held a rifle. It wasn't loaded, of course. My father knelt beside me on the back porch, hands over mine, and showed me how to hold it steady. He didn't smile, he didn't scold, he just said, "Never point this at anything you don't intend to destroy." That line stuck with me. Not because it was frightening, but because it was final. It taught me right then and there that this wasn't a game. It was serious. And I was expected to act accordingly. By the time I was 8, I knew how to clean a bolt-action rifle. I could name every part of a shotgun and tell you what kind of choke to use for ducks versus pheasant. And by 13, I had my hunter safety certification, earned after weeks of classes at the Grange Hall, where a retired game warden named Mr. Clay taught us everything from trigger discipline to wilderness first aid. But more than the technical stuff, he taught us ethics. He said, you don't shoot unless you're sure. Not just sure you can hit, but sure it's right to do it. And we listened, because in those days, adults didn't waste words. And when they spoke, you paid attention. We weren't afraid of guns, but we respected them deeply. It was the same kind of respect we had for rivers during flood season, or for barns filled with hay and old nails, or for the giant belt-driven machines at the mill. You didn't fear them, but you didn't forget what they could do. And that, I think, was part of growing up. We learned to carry weight, not just in our hands, but in our decisions. We were trusted with things that mattered. And that trust made us careful, made us thoughtful, even when we were still small. I still remember my first time hunting with my father. We were up before sunrise, packing thermoses of coffee and bacon sandwiches into his old canvas bag. The woods were silent, except for our boots on frost-bitten leaves and the occasional snap of a branch beneath our feet. He didn't say much that morning. He never did when we were in the woods. But I watched how he moved, slow, deliberate, always scanning, always aware. He showed me how to read tracks, how to move against the wind, how to pause long enough to really listen. We didn't get anything that day, but when we got home, he patted my shoulder and said, "You were patient. That's the first thing you learn." And that was enough. Guns taught us patience. They taught us respect. And in a way, they taught us gentleness too. Because once you understand what real power is, you don't throw it around. You carry it carefully. You grow into it. It's strange, maybe, but learning to handle something that could take a life made me value life more, not less. It made me think twice before lashing out, even in words. It made me aware of how fragile things really were. And it wasn't just about hunting. Sometimes we'd go out to the quarry and shoot at cans lined up on fence posts. We'd take turns, laugh when we missed, cheer when someone hit the last one clean off. But even then, no roughhousing, no waving barrels, no fooling around. We policed each other. Because our parents had taught us that trust was something sacred. Something you didn't mess with, not once. And I think that's one of the most important parts of growing up back then. We were allowed to do things, dangerous things even, but only because we were expected to rise to the level of that responsibility. We weren't sheltered, we were taught. And once you were taught, you were held to that standard. No excuses, no shortcuts. We fixed fences with real hammers. We rode bikes down gravel hills with no helmets. We cooked over open fires. We climbed trees higher than we probably should have. And through all of it, we were quietly learning how to measure risk, how to stay alert, how to think ahead. Those lessons weren't loud. They came in moments, in scraped knees, in missed shots, in quiet corrections from a father's voice, but they added up. They shaped us. And in time, those little lessons turned into a kind of steadiness, a way of moving through the world that wasn't reactive, but aware. People ask me sometimes if it was safe to raise kids that way, if it was right to put so much responsibility on someone so young. And I get the question. The world feels different now, louder, faster, full of warnings and rules and caution signs. But I look back on those days, and I remember the feeling. Not of being fearless, but of being trusted. I remember the way my father handed me that rifle, not carelessly, not casually, but confidently, as if to say, "You're ready for this. I believe in you." And that belief, that quiet, unwavering belief, did something to a boy. It made him stand a little taller. It made him pay a little more attention. It made him want to deserve that trust. And that, more than anything, is what growing up meant to me. Not birthdays, not grades, not milestones marked by candles or parties, but those quiet moments when someone gave you something real and expected you to carry it well. A shovel, a fishing pole, a hammer, a rifle, a responsibility. And when you did, when you showed that you could be steady, thoughtful, careful, they gave you more, not things, but trust. And that was the gift that made you grow. You didn't have to be rich to be generous in a town like Cottage Grove. In fact, most folks I knew didn't have much money at all. But what they did have was time and heart, and a willingness to show up when someone else needed a hand. Help didn't come in the form of charities or organizations or GoFundMe pages. It came in the form of neighbors knocking on your door before you even had the courage to ask. I learned that early. When I was about 7, a boy down the street, Henry, lost his father in a logging accident. I didn't really understand what had happened, just that things got quiet at their house, no music from the radio, no laughter from the yard. And one morning, without any fuss, my mum packed a basket of bread, stew, and apple cobbler. She took my hand and we walked it down together. She didn't ring the bell, just left the basket on the porch with a folded note tucked beneath the cloth. No signatures, no speeches, just kindness. Later that week, I helped her pick peaches for Mrs. Dalrymple, who'd broken her hip. We canned them in glass jars, wiped the rims clean, and delivered them 2 at a time. That was the rhythm of things back then. Somebody got sick, you brought soup. Somebody lost a job, you passed the hat at the feed store. Somebody had a baby, you showed up with diapers and casseroles and fresh sheets for the crib. No one kept score, no one expected thank you cards. It was just what you did. And kids didn't sit on the sidelines either. My dad would say, "Come on, Walter, we're going to help Mr. Tully patch his fence." Or, "Grab your boots, we're hauling wood for the church today." And I'd go, not because I understood the full weight of what we were doing, but because I was proud to be included. Because when you're young and someone invites you to help, what they're really saying is, you matter, you have something to give, you're part of this. And that kind of belonging, that quiet sense of usefulness, it sticks. I remember one fall when a neighbour's cow went into labour early. My dad and I spent half the night in their barn, lantern light flickering off the rafters, steam rising from the animal's breath. I held buckets and blankets. My dad whispered calmly to the farmer, who was pacing like a nervous father in a hospital hallway. And when the car finally arrived, wobbly, slick, blinking against the cold, I felt something I didn't yet have words for. Responsibility, connection, joy. Helping others wasn't something we aspired to. It was just built into the bones of how we lived. And it wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was as small as waving someone through the intersection with a smile, or stopping by the school early to sweep the front steps before the first bell rang, or walking an elderly neighbour's dog when their hip acted up again. These weren't acts of service, they were just life. And I think that's what made them so powerful, because they weren't done to earn credit. They were done because it felt right. There was a kind of quiet dignity in it, in showing up for one another, in looking someone in the eye and saying, without saying it, "You're not alone." And when hard times came, and they always came, that same spirit showed up. I remember the winter my dad was laid off from the mill. Money got tight, really tight. We cut back on everything. No new clothes, no Christmas tree that year, just a few paper ornaments strung across the window. But one morning we found a sack of groceries on our porch. Flour, beans, sugar, coffee, no note, no name. Just a quiet gesture that said, "We've got you." And my parents? They didn't cry, they didn't make a fuss. They just nodded at each other, and my mum said, "We'll pay it forward." And we did. The next time someone needed help moving hay or fixing a leaky roof or mending a fence, we were there, because that's how the circle worked. It wasn't charity, it was community. Not transactional, but relational, built not on debt, but on trust. And maybe that's what I miss most about those years, not the nostalgia or the simplicity or even the slower pace, but the connectedness. The feeling that no matter what happened, you'd never fall all the way down, because someone, somewhere, would catch you. Not with speeches, not with noise, but with a hammer, or a meal, or a quiet knock on the door. I think about that now, when the world feels loud and divided. When helping someone seems like an event instead of a habit. When people post more about giving than actually giving. And I wonder, what would it feel like to return to that? To a place where help wasn't dramatic, but ordinary. Where kindness was so woven into daily life you didn't even call it kindness. You just called it being a neighbor. Cottage Grove was far from perfect. There were arguments, there were grudges that lasted longer than they should have, but when someone was in need, all that faded because the need was bigger than the differences. And when you're young and you see that over and over again, it shapes you. It tells you that compassion doesn't need an audience, that love doesn't have to shout to be heard, that the strongest hands are often the quietest. And now, years later, when I help someone carry groceries to their car, or stop to fix a flat, or bring soup to a neighbor who's under the weather, I'm not trying to be noble. I'm just remembering. Remembering my mom standing on the porch with a covered dish. My dad lifting boards onto a neighbor's truck bed. The warmth of those early lessons, not taught in words, but lived out in example. Helping hands, human hearts, that's what held our town together. And maybe in some small way, it still does. Food in our house wasn't fancy. It wasn't something we photographed or talked about at length, but it mattered deeply. It brought us together. It filled more than our stomachs. It shaped how we saw the world, through sharing, through sacrifice, through the quiet rhythm of home-cooked meals. Most of what we ate came from the land around us. Vegetables from our garden, eggs from the chickens, milk from the neighbor's cow, traded for firewood or fence work. And meat, well, that usually came from what we hunted or raised ourselves. I remember helping my dad clean fish on the back porch, the boards slick with water and scales, or standing beside him in the shed as he butchered a deer, every movement careful, respectful. He'd say, "We don't waste anything, son, not a thing." And we didn't. We made stews, roasts, soups that simmered all day. My mum had a way with a cast iron skillet. Everything she cooked tasted like warmth. Cornbread that crumbled just right. Beans seasoned with bits of ham bone. And pies, Lord, the pies, apple in the fall. Blackberry in summer, always made from scratch, always with love. Dinner wasn't about what was new or exciting. It was about what was enough. And enough didn't mean a full table. It meant no one left it hungry. We didn't snack much, maybe an apple after school, or a slice of bread with butter and cinnamon on cold mornings. And when we did have something sweet, cookies, Kool-Aid, banana pudding, it felt like a celebration. I still remember that big green tin of Kool-Aid powder in the cupboard. We'd mix it strong, way too much sugar. Sometimes it was so sweet the bottom of the pitcher had a layer of undissolved crystals you could scoop with a spoon. It wasn't healthy, but it was ours. And on a hot day, nothing tasted better. Most days we ate around the same time, early evening when the work was done and the sun hung low. No TV, no phones, just voices, forks on plates, and the occasional thud of someone passing the salt a little too hard. We prayed before every meal, not because we had to, but because it reminded us this didn't come easy. Someone grew it, someone prepared it, someone shared it. There was reverence in that. And it wasn't just the food. It was what we learned around the table. That you listen when someone else is talking, that you take the smallest piece if you're last in line, that you help clear the dishes even if you didn't make the mess. The table was where we learned our manners, our humility, our place in the family, and maybe in the world. There were lessons too in what we didn't have. We didn't eat out much. Once in a while, we'd go to the diner on Main Street. Burgers, fries, and a root beer float if you'd been especially good. It felt like a holiday. Fast food was rare. Microwaves didn't exist. If you were hungry, you peeled, chopped, stirred, waited. It taught patience, gratitude. And that flavor wasn't in the seasoning, it was in the effort. Even when times were lean, when my dad's hours got cut, or the garden didn't do well, we still found a way. Beans stretched a long way. Biscuits could turn a simple soup into a meal. And there was always someone nearby with a basket of tomatoes or extra eggs. Food was a language of care, of showing up, of saying, I see you, I've got enough to share. I learned a lot about life from watching my mother cook. The way she measured without measuring. The way she tasted with her eyes closed. The way she moved with both urgency and grace. And my father, he taught me the other half. How to plant. How to weed. How to harvest at just the right time before the frost could steal it. They never said it out loud, but every meal we made was a kind of testament to survival, to care, to tradition. And now, years later, I find myself remembering not just the meals, but the meanings inside them. The sound of a spoon scraping the last of the gravy. The hush that fell over the table when everyone was hungry and grateful. The way my sister would always save the last bite of pie for our dog who waited patiently under the table. These weren't just meals, they were moments tucked inside the ordinary, waiting to be remembered. And now, in a world full of drive-thrus and doorbells that bring food to your front step, I sometimes wonder what we've lost. Not convenience, not options, but the slowness, the togetherness, the quiet act of preparing something with your own hands and sharing it with people you love. That's what we knew back then. Not recipes or nutrition labels or fad diets, but how to care, how to gather, how to be satisfied with enough. And maybe that's still what matters most. I've told you a lot about what was good, the warmth, the slowness, the safety, the porch lights that stayed on, the people who showed up, the meals that filled more than your stomach. But it wouldn't be honest if I didn't tell you. It wasn't perfect. No time ever is. There were shadows in that era, quiet ones that lingered behind the screen doors and inside the silence. We didn't talk about mental illness. If someone was struggling, they were tired or not quite themselves. People whispered about nerves, about needing rest, but no one used words like depression or trauma. There was shame in the things we now know should have been met with compassion. And folks with disabilities, well, they weren't seen much. Our town wasn't built with ramps or railings. Kids in wheelchairs didn't go to our school, not because they weren't welcome, but because the system didn't know what to do with them. It was like the world had no space for anything outside of normal. Then there was race. Cottage Grove was mostly white. We didn't talk much about difference because difference was rarely present, but when it was, it showed. I remember once, must have been around 61, a black family stopped in town while driving north. They pulled into the diner and I saw the way people stiffened. No one said anything cruel, but no one said anything kind either. That kind of silence, that was a shadow too, and it wasn't just race. Other differences, religion, background, who you loved, those things were kept quiet. Not out of hatred, always, but out of fear. Fear of standing out. Fear of losing place in a town that prized sameness. The Cold War was humming beneath everything, even if we didn't talk about it over dinner. There were drills at school, duck and cover, as if a wooden desk could protect you from the end of the world. I remember the tension in my father's voice when he read about the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Register Guard. There was an underlying sense that the world might not stay safe forever, that the good we were living in could slip away, quietly or suddenly. And for some people, that fear turned inward. It made them suspicious, judgmental, cold. And yet, most of the time those shadows stayed soft because they were wrapped in the warmth of what was good. The neighbors still brought soup, the porch lights still flickered on, the pies still cooled on windowsills. But looking back, I can see them more clearly now. The things we didn't say, the people we didn't see, the pain that sat beneath the surface of smiles. And I don't bring this up to ruin the memory. I bring it up because memories should be honest, not perfect, not polished, just true. The truth is, we lived in a world full of kindness and contradictions. We had front doors that stayed unlocked and minds that sometimes stayed closed. We had deep loyalty and deep silence around certain truths. But in all of that, I believe we were still trying to love, trying to raise our kids right, trying to hold on to something good, even as the world around us shifted and stretched in ways we didn't understand. And maybe that's what growing up in the 1950s really meant. Not just the sweetness of Kool-Aid and porch swings, not just family dinners and fireflies and unlocked doors, but learning that even the brightest summer days cast shadows, and learning slowly how to hold both in your hand. The good and the hard, the light and the quiet dark, and choosing again and again to move toward kindness. There's something about small towns that lingers. Long after the people have moved away, after the last bakery closes, after the post office gets absorbed by the next bigger town over, something remains. Not in the buildings, but in the feeling, the pace, the way people looked at each other when they waved from the sidewalk. Cottage Grove. That was my town. Not perfect, not remarkable in the eyes of the world, but to me, it was everything. And maybe that's the strangest thing about growing older, realizing that the places that made you don't quite exist anymore. Or if they do, they've changed so slowly, so subtly, that you can't tell if it's the town that's faded or just your memory of it. But I remember the smell of warm asphalt on a July afternoon and how the tar bubbled up through the cracks in the sidewalk. I remember the taste of blackberry jam on toast made from berries we picked barefoot behind the old grain silo. I remember the quiet hum of a fan in the classroom as our teacher read aloud from a thick history book, one that still called the West Untamed. And I remember how the town felt before dinner, when the windows lit up and porch doors creaked and someone down the block strummed a guitar on their steps, and it felt like the whole neighborhood exhaled at once. They say the past is a foreign country. And maybe that's true, because these days I walk through towns that look a lot like mine used to. But something's different. It's not just the LED signs or the chain stores or the fact that kids don't ride their bikes to the creek anymore. It's the quietness that's gone. Not silence, but quietness. The kind that lives inside a slow afternoon. The kind you can feel on a front porch swing or in the pause before someone says grace at supper. That's what's missing now. We traded it for speed, for noise, for screens that buzz in our pockets and tell us what's urgent, even when nothing really is. But back then we had time. Time to stop and talk, time to wave, time to sit and just be, without the need to produce, explain, or perform. Cottage Grove was the kind of place where you could do nothing for an hour and not feel guilty. Where the slowness wasn't laziness, it was presence. And that presence is something I've tried to carry with me. Even now. Even in a world that barely stops to catch its breath. I still wake up early, make coffee the old way. Stand at the window and watch the light change. It's small, I know. But it's a kind of remembering. Because places like Cottage Grove don't vanish all at once. They drift, like mist rising off a field in the morning. There, then gone, then there, again, in memory. Sometimes I wonder what happened to the kids I grew up with. Where they went, what they became. Whether they remember the same things I do, the smell of fresh pencils on the first day of school, the way the creek bent behind old Miller's farm, or the single blinking red light downtown that seemed to pause just long enough for everyone to feel safe. There's a kind of ache in that wondering. But it's not a sad ache. It's soft, like an old quilt, worn at the corners, faded in places, but still warm. People ask me sometimes if I'd go back, if I could. If someone handed me a golden ticket and said, 1957 Cottage Grove, one way, and I think about that, really think about it. Not because I believe everything was better then, but because I believe some things were. Not the politics or the medicine or the way we overlooked so many people, but the slowness, the kindness, the belief that your neighbor's well-being was your business. The way time stretched like taffy on a summer day until the sun sank low and the world turned quiet. That's what I'd go back for. And yet, maybe we don't have to go back. Maybe we carry that with us. In the way we treat strangers, in the way we slow down for our children, in the way we set the table at night, even when we're eating alone. Maybe Cottage Grove was never about a dot on the map. Maybe it was about a way of being, and we can still choose that. Choose warmth over noise, presence over performance, people over pace. I think that's why I tell these stories. Not just to remember, but to remind. to say to someone out there, maybe to you, listening tonight, that the world we came from wasn't perfect, but it held something worth keeping, something worth reviving.
Even now, especially now.
So if you're still awake, maybe tomorrow you'll wave to someone you pass. Maybe you'll write that letter you've been meaning to send. Maybe you'll sit with your coffee a little longer, look out the window, and let the light come in. That's where it lives. That's where the town is.
Right there. In the space between seconds. In the quiet you choose. In the love you show, even when no one's watching. They say time forgets places like mine. But maybe, just maybe, we don't have to. Not if we remember out loud. Not if we keep telling the stories. Not if we carry the porch light in our hearts and leave it on for whoever's still coming home.
Good night.